Hope everyone's day is going well. In this video, we're going to take a look at how to design this apartment app UI that we created in Adobe XD. And we'll also be using Auto-Animate to add some animations to our project. What you see on the screen is the final result. We've got screen 1 and screen 2, and we also have this little slider that we could show in our preview section. So what happens is if we slide over or drag the screen to the left, it transitions with the name of the apartment complex and the location changing, as well as the rating and the total reviews. So if we click, the transition occurs from one slide to another. In actuality, what should happen is if we select the prototype screen and we select an action, what should happen is the trigger should be dragged, so that we should just drag back and forth. But I had the tap trigger set just so we could show some easing in our project. If we select the easing to ease in and out, we could see, let's turn up the duration to 0.8. We could see we have a smoother transition rather than dragging, but ultimately we do want to add the dragging feature. So to get things started, I will have a starter file in the description as well as the final project. We are using an iPhone XR/XX Max. To get that artboard, all you need to do is select the A trigger on the mouse, on the keyboard. All you need to do is select the A trigger on the keyboard and select the iPhone XR/XX Max. I do have the grids enabled, and you can simply do that by selecting the artboard and turning on the grid. We'll be using the default grid with the gutter width set to 10, column width 78, and I think this is the margins in between, on each side is 36 pixels. The colors are in the top left section. The fonts that we're going to be using is a circular font. The San Francisco Pro Text semi-bold font does represent the clock for our iPhone artboard. And we do have components that represent icons. And like I said, you can grab the project files in the description. First things first, we're going to go ahead and create our navigation section down below. So let's just zoom in and select a rectangle tool and just stretch out the rectangle tool across the artboard and set the height to 98 pixels. Align it to the bottom of the artboard, and we could turn off the border. Enable the drop shadow and select the opacity of the fill to 4%, changing the Y to -3 and the blur to 10 pixels. If we select the preview artboard, we can see the shadow being displayed. Next, let's go ahead and drop in our 3 icons, and what these icons represent is the home screen or the main icon, and also we have a heart which represents favorites and a settings which represents the settings. So dropping in those icons, let's go ahead and align them. To align items, what we could do is select each icon and select the background and then simply hit the align to center. And that would align it to center vertically, but we do not want to align it center horizontally. In our case, we do want the margin left to be set to 96 pixels. So let's go ahead and set that there. And for the settings tab or the settings icon, we do want it set to 96 pixels right. We are going to do our best to follow an 8-point grid system. So that's why we're setting the margins to 96 pixels. And if we check the margins of the top and bottom, we can see that they are set to 32 pixels and the bottom is 32.1, just getting it as close as possible to 32 pixels. Same goes for the heart. We set it at 40 pixels and the settings, it's 38. So this is a little tricky to do when dealing with icons, specifically because not all icons have the same height and width. So you just want to do your best to get it as close as possible. Now that we have the icons aligned, what we could do next is we need to indicate that the actual home page or the home screen icon is selected. So what we could do is just select a rectangle tool and add a yellow bar that will span across the width of our main icon, indicating that this is the active screen. Turning off the border and add the fill to yellow. Go ahead and change the height to 2 pixels and the width to 80 pixels, as well as setting a border radius of 4 pixels. Go ahead and select the rectangle tool and the rectangle tool behind it, and just make sure you center the yellow item to the center of the background navigation. That looks great. We have our navigation set. Now we can move on to the search bar. So if we scroll up a bit, what we could do next is select a rectangle tool and let's just make a search bar. We are going to delete this, but we're just using this as a guide for now. The height of this is going to be set to 24 pixels and it's going to be set 32 pixels of margin top from our phone number, and battery percentage. I'm not really sure what this is called, but it's on every iPhone, I guess hotbar. But go ahead and set that to 32 pixels top. And what we could do is drop in the search bar icon and just align it to the far left. Make sure that it's aligned to the left side of the column. And we can also select the text tool and just spell out a city. In our case, we're going to select Dallas, Texas, since that is where we're from. And the character styles are going to be circular font with the font size set to 16 pixels and the font weight set to book. The line height is going to be 20 pixels and the color is going to be our main dark color, which is a 212121. I don't need this. We could just select the colors and it will fill. Go ahead and align this to the center of our rectangle, and it's going to have a margin left of 16 pixels from the search bar. We can go ahead and delete this guide that we set, and we've kind of got our search bar here. So if this was an actual prototype, what would happen is we select this top area right here. It will allow us to pop the keyboard up and let us type a certain city that we want to search for. Next, we're going to go ahead and create our filters or our tags. So I'm going to create one and then just copy them and create two more. So the first one's going to represent a 1-bedroom tag or a filter. And let's go ahead and shape this and create the perfect size. Our height is going to be set to 32 pixels. And our width is going to be the same size of our column, so 78 pixels. Next, we want to change the border color. Why do I keep clicking this eyedropper? Next, we want to set the border color to that dark black, which is a 212121. So you can just apply it as border and bump up the border radius to 4 pixels. We can then select a text tool and just type in 1bed, select that black color and drop the font size of this down to 12 pixels, leaving that book font height or the font weight. We can just align this to the center. And we also want to drop in our home icon to represent a bed. I did my best trying to find a bed, but I couldn't really find a good bed icon, so I'm just going to use a home. Our icons today do come from Feather Icons. It's an icon library I always love to use. The only icon that doesn't come from there is our main icon or our home icon with the 4 circles. And the search icon was just edited just a tiny bit. But go ahead and center the 1bed and the home icon. Let's group them and then center them. We then can just copy this and add a margin right of 16 pixels. And we can change the 1bed to a bath. And one thing I forgot to actually note is the fact that when centering items, you want to make sure that we're sticking to that 8-point grid. So our items are not correctly centered. We have 14 pixels on the left and 18 pixels on the right. We want to make sure we got 16 and 16 on both sides. So selecting both of them, we do want to center them as best as possible. If we look now, we have them at 16 pixels and 16 pixels. The top and bottom is set from 9 and 8. In this case, it doesn't really matter too much. When it comes to code, we can justify the line height, but typically in Adobe XD, we do have trouble with identifying line height, and it always adds extra space for no reason on text. I'm sure there's a reason, but I'm not really entirely sure why. We can then jump to our bath icon and delete the home and drop in the droplet and just center that with the 1bath and just make sure we have 16 pixels on both sides. Finally, we'll copy and paste this one more time and just change it to a pool, deleting that droplet and replacing it with the sun icon. 8 pixels between, center them and get them to 16 pixels on both sides. Now that our tags are done, we can then jump on to creating the city location and the apartment name. So to add the city name, go ahead and select the text layer. And in our case, we're going to write downtown Dallas, setting the color to 929 BAB. And we also want to align this to the far left of our column and setting the margin top to 32 pixels. And having our font size to 14 pixels, and we could leave the font or the line height, to 20 pixels. Next, we can just copy this down and then change this to Camden Victory Park, which is our apartment name, and bump up the font size to 28 pixels. And the font weight's going to be set to bold, as well as change the color to 212121, and then make sure the margin top is set to 8 pixels. Next on our plate, we need to add our image. So to do that, go ahead and select the rectangle tool, make it stretch from the far left column to the far right column, and set the height to 440 pixels. making the width set to 342 pixels. Make the border radius 4 pixels, and then we can drag and drop our image. Today's wonderful imagery comes from Unsplash, and our first image does come from Francesca, and the second image comes from Jessica. To simply add these images, what we could do is just download them, and then just simply drag and drop them onto our rectangle. When building projects, I do recommend to download the images and store them in a folder, that way you can always reference them. Go ahead and turn off the border so that we can get rid of that, and we'll want to add a drop shadow. We're going to want to leave the drop shadow set to 16 pixels on the opacity, but the Y is going to be changed to 4 and our blur is set to 16 pixels. We also want to overlay the images with a gradient to darken it a bit. Since we are adding white text over the image on the bottom, we do want to create a gradient that is dark on the bottom and lights up to the top. So what we could do is just simply copy and paste the image over our current image, but then change the fill to a linear gradient, and setting the lighter side of the gradient, or the far left one, to an opacity of 0, and bringing this down halfway on the image. What I recommend also is just go ahead and turn off the grid, since we aren't really using it right now, and just focus on creating the best gradient that you can. If we select the fill, let me move the preview section. If we select the fill and go to our far right or our bottom color, what we can do is set this color to 000, and that will give us a dark black, and then turn up the opacity to 50%. And we also want to stretch this just a bit. So if we add another point on our linear gradient and just move it up about to the starting point of where our white text would start, and then just turn up the percentage to 40%. That way we can have this dark section, and then anywhere there isn't text, we can kind of give the full color of the image rather than making it dark. Now we can then move on to the description of our apartment. So go ahead and select text tool, and in here we're gonna write the pricing. So change the color to white, and that didn't save, doesn't matter. So the pricing of our place is $1,439 to $1,479. Change the color of this to white, and we can change the font size to 24 pixels as well as the font weight to bold. And make sure that the pricing is 60 pixels from the left, so margin of 16 pixels or a padding of 16 pixels, as well as a padding bottom of 70 pixels. We can then just option click drag this to create a copy, and then in here we want to drop the font size to 16 pixels as well as the font weight to book, and then just add more information regarding our apartment. So this apartment is going to be a 1-bedroom, and then we'll have this sort of section break with a 1 bath, which is 1 BA. And let's add spacings here. So 1 bed, 1 bath. And let's go ahead and add the square footage. So the square footage is going to be set to 661 square feet. And finally square feet. I can't even. And finally we can copy and paste again and drop the font size down to 14 pixels and just let users know that there's 2 units available. Now the margins of each section is going to be 8 pixels. So this is currently set to 8 pixels, and then this will also be set to 8 pixels, leaving the margin on the bottom, or the padding on the bottom, to 16 pixels. Finally, our last section is the total reviews and the rating of our location. So that section is going to have a text area that's going to say 256 total reviews. And it's currently having white text. What we could do is just change that to black text. And I definitely misspelled total. But this section is going to have a margin top of 40 pixels from our image. Let's turn on the grid so that we can make sure everything is aligned correctly. And we can then just copy this and change this to 4.8. And also make sure you drop the font size to both these items to 12 pixels and drop in our little star. Aligning the star with the 4.8, go ahead and push these to the far right in our column and make sure that the margin top is 32 pixels as well. So looking at our preview section, I'm not really liking the size of this down here of the total reviews. That seems a little too small. So what we're going to do is just bump it up to 16 pixels instead of 12. And for our rating, we can just bump this up to 14 pixels and just make sure everything is aligned. Perfect. So we've got our first screen pretty much complete. What we need to do is add in our next slide. So to do that, it's simply copy our current slide. But first, let's go ahead and grab all this since we do have that linear gradient. Let's turn off the grid because it's bothering me. Go ahead and grab all of our elements for our first slide and group them together. And then let's close this. We can create a copy and just change the information here. So the information is going to be a cheaper price, setting this to 1,124 to 1,528. We're still keeping the 1 bed, 1 bath, but we are increasing the square footage. So the square footage is equivalent to 742 square feet. And the amount of units is changing, setting that to 6 units available. To change the background image, you want to make sure you move the gradient first out of the way and then drag and drop the image onto the rectangle image or the background image. So select the gradient and just move that out the way. And then we can switch back to our image and just drag and drop that to the background image. Not affecting the gradient at all. We could then just grab the gradient and then just align it. Go ahead and move this back into the artboard, and we're going to set a margin of 16 pixels and just click out the artboard. If we go ahead and preview our artboard, we can see our first screen completely finished. Now, to create that transition, 2 things need to happen. We first need to mask our slides, and we also need to mask our 2 text layers so that we can create that transition effect. To do our animations, let's go ahead and mask our layers. So first, let's mask our slide items. So select a rectangle tool, and we want to make it the same height as our artboard. The width should extend out far across the artboard. Now to mask our slides, let's go ahead and have the rectangle tool above the 2 items. And we could just select the 2 items and the rectangle tool and just hit Command-Shift-M. This will create a mask around our rectangle so you can see that it's being cut off. Now go ahead and select the rectangle itself and let's just align it to our artboard. Now that we have our slides masked, we do need to create a mask for our apartment name and city name. So let's zoom in here. Now to create a mask for our text item, we can select the rectangle tool and just completely cover it. And just selecting the text layer and the rectangle tool, we could just hit Control-Shift-M, and that will create a mask around our Camden Victory Park. And then going inside that mask, what we could then do is just copy and paste our text layer and just drag it underneath our current text layer or the Camden Victory Park, and this will create a mask. So you cannot see anything underneath the height of that mask. So if we double click in and just change the content of our Camden Victory Park or that second content, changing that to Atera or Atera Apartments, which represents our second slide. What will then happen is when we transition, we will just bump the Camden Victory Park up and then change it with our Atera Apartments. This will create that transition effect. And anything above our heights here is just pretty much disappearing. So it's just going to go back and forth. For our first screen, we do want to keep it to that Camden Victory Park. Then we're finally going to do the exact same thing with our downtown Dallas. Go ahead and select the rectangle tool. Selecting both items, click Control-Shift-M. And then inside the mask, we want to just copy and paste the downtown Dallas. But first, I want to make sure that the height of this is correct. So make sure that it's just aligned to the text layer so that we don't have extra space. And then just double clicking in our text layer, creating a copy, pushing it down, changing the content to Uptown Dallas instead of Downtown Dallas. And if we just click out, we can see that the Uptown Dallas and the Atera Apartments are completely hidden. But then when the transition does happen, we'll move the Downtown Dallas up along with the Uptown Dallas, same for the Victory Park. So that's our transition. Now that we have our initial screen set, we can just create a copy of our first screen and rename this to screen 2. And then finally, in screen 2 is where all that magical happens. So if we double click on our downtown Dallas, we can then push up Uptown and push up the downtown Dallas text layers and do the same thing for the Camden Victory Park. Pushing those values up and just replacing them. We'll want to do the exact same thing for our slide. So selecting the first slide and the second slide, we just want to move them across. And we can turn on the grid just to make sure everything is aligned correctly. So then selecting the 2 slides again, just make sure this is aligned perfectly. Go ahead and remove the grid layer and we'll have our first screen, which is the first item, and then our second screen, which is the Atera Apartments. We can also change the values of the 256 and the 4.8, but in this case, I don't really care about it too much. Jumping into the prototype screen, go ahead and select, okay, we got it. What we want to do is select the first slide and setting the wire to screen 2. And for the interaction, leave it as drag for now, and just do the same for our screen 2. So in screen 2, select the second slide and just drag it back to screen 1, leaving that drag trigger. If we go ahead and select the preview tool, what should happen is if we drag our items, that animation should occur like so. In the completed mock, I do have an effect where the background image is zooming in and out when you're transitioning. And to do that, what we're going to do is in screen 1 for our second slide, we'll just blow up the background image. So switch over back to the design tab and select the second slide on screen 1. We want to make sure we move the linear gradient out the way and make sure we click on our background image. Double click the background image and make sure you're selecting the image itself and not necessarily the rectangle. Go ahead and increase the size of this background image however much you want, and then just simply click out. Make sure you also align the linear gradient back to the center. And now watch what happens as we slide. We can see the background image have that transition effect. So every time we set it back, the size of the background image is being changed. To add that smoother animation, we could just jump back into the prototype tool, select the slide and change the trigger from drag to tap, select the action as Auto-Animate, and the easing, we want to set it to ease in and out and turn up the duration to 0.8. Now what happens when we tap on our slide 1 in screen 1, we will get a smoother animation rather than the drag trigger that we have on the second slide. That's going to do it for me in this video. I am coming out with additional GSAP tutorials, so look out for those. Don't forget to leave a like, that truly helps me out, and don't forget to subscribe. That's going to do it for me. Have a wonderful day.